In just 5 minutes, a powerful judge tried to silence Jasmine Crockett with a $15,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, just power abused. But what he didn't expect was that this very moment would push him to the brink of his own downfall. What was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing exploded into a breathless battle between arrogance and justice. Can a black woman armed only with law and courage bring an entire system to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was a cold, gray morning in downtown Chicago. Courtroom 2A was scheduled for a minor procedural hearing, just a quick check on paperwork. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Jasmine, a seasoned lawyer and former prosecutor, had seen enough to sense when a room was rigged, the silence was too deep. The court staff avoided eye contact. Even the walls felt like they were listening. Judge Richard Monroe was already seated tall, stern, and known for pushing verdicts through without hearing full arguments. He didn't read files, he delivered sentences. His cold stare followed Jasmine as she walked in. He didn't look at her like a lawyer. He looked at her like an obstacle. The courtroom felt like a trap, and Jasmine was walking straight into it. Everyone could feel it. The air wasn't just tense, it was controlled. The judge wasn't there for justice. He was there for power. Judge Monroe entered with a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He didn't pause. He didn't greet the court. He didn't glance at the counsel tables. He simply sat, adjusted his robe with one sharp tug, and then looked straight ahead, eyes cold and flat. His voice came next, low-clipped and without hesitation. This matter is already clear. The defendant is in violation of Code 22. The fine is $15,000 to be paid immediately. That is the court's decision. No build-up, no explanation, no process, just a blunt declaration, as if the case had already been tried and buried long before the doors even opened. Jasmine hadn't spoken a word. Her files were still closed, her hands resting calmly on the table just moments earlier, now curled, slightly controlled but tense across the room. Even the prosecutor looked up in confusion, brows furrowed, shifting in his seat like he'd missed something crucial. He hadn't everyone had, because there hadn't been anything to miss. No arguments, no evidence, not even the usual procedural opening, just a ruling, final, cold, irrevocable. It was a legal firing squad, and Jasmine was expected to nod, accept it, and walk away wounded. She didn't. But first she tried to understand. "Your Honor," she said carefully, rising just halfway from her seat with all respect. "We haven't even begun. I haven't presented a single argument." Monroe's eyes narrowed, not with reconsideration, but with irritation, because none are needed. He snapped, "You violated the code. It's not up for debate." Tone wasn't simply dismissive, it was biting, deliberate, meant to humiliate. This wasn't a misunderstanding of the law. It was a calculated message. Sit down. Be quiet. Don't challenge this court. Jasmine didn't react the way most people would in that moment. No raised voice, no visible frustration. She remained standing, her hands calmly folded in front of her. Every movement, precise, controlled. Her heart might have been pounding beneath her tailored blazer, but on the outside she was unshakable. That control wasn't just instinct, it was training. Years as a prosecutor had taught her that in a courtroom where power is misused, restraint is the sharpest weapon. She took a breath, then spoke with clarity and purpose. "Your Honor, with full respect, I am formally requesting defense due process requires that I be heard." Her voice cut through the silence, not loud but unmistakably firm. Her words carried not just legal authority but moral weight. She wasn't asking, she was invoking a right. But Monroe didn't flinch. He didn't even pretend to consider her request. He looked straight at her now, but not with fairness. His eyes narrowed, jaw locked, as if her mere words had offended him. He leaned forward, both elbows on the bench, and said louder this time, "Miss Crockett, this is not your stage. This is my courtroom, and I will not entertain speeches or stall tactics." The words cracked like a whip across the room. "The violation is on record. The fine is final. You want to argue, take it to appeals. If it gets that far, his tone was sharp, final, and laced with contempt. Not legal skepticism, personal contempt. The kind that turns rulings into punishments and punishments into warnings for everyone watching. The courtroom had become a theater of intimidation, and Jasmine was the target. She didn't move. She stood like a statue under pressure, but inside her mind, everything accelerated, fast, focused. This wasn't legal procedure. It was an execution of control. Monroe wasn't upholding the law. He was using the bench as a throne. His voice, his posture, his refusal to even let her speak at all, pointed to one truth. He had already made up his mind, and nothing she said would change it. But it wasn't just about her case. It was about silencing her in front of everyone to make an example, to remind every attorney, every clerk, every citizen watching from the gallery. You challenge me and I will crush you openly without hesitation. Jasmine could feel it. This wasn't about the code violation anymore. It was about her presence, her confidence, her unwillingness to play submissive. Monroe wasn't reacting to law. He was reacting to her power, her voice, and now he was trying to strip it from her. One ruling at a time, the prosecutor avoided eye contact. The court reporter had paused her fingers. The room wasn't neutral anymore. It had turned hostile, and yet in that silence, Jasmine found clarity. Monroe had made one thing absolutely clear. He never planned to give her a fair hearing. He didn't come to listen. He came to dominate. Still, she didn't sit. She didn't fold. Her voice was lower now, but stronger. Then I suppose. She said, eyes locked on his, we proceed on the record, every word, every step. Because if the law wouldn't protect her today, the truth would, and every injustice needs a witness. And that was when Jasmine made her move, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to a man like Judge Monroe, clarity. She had watched enough by then to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't haste. This was surgical suppression. She wasn't being fined for a code violation. She was being silenced for who she was, for the strength in her voice and the refusal in her posture. Everything in Monroe's courtroom had been arranged to deliver a message. You don't belong here. You may know the law, but I own the bench. He had the gavel, but Jasmine had something heavier, precedent. And as she reached into her folder, the shift in the room was almost audible. The quiet wasn't respect anymore. It was anticipation. The kind of stillness before the first domino falls. She laid out the documents on the desk in front of her like pieces to a machine. Only she knew how to operate. Each page had been chosen, marked, and rehearsed for exactly this moment. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, sharp. We're about to talk precedent because what you're doing has already been judged and it didn't hold up. She raised the first State of Illinois, 2017. The defendant was fined under a local enforcement code. No photos, no inspection reports, no affidavit. Just the officer's claim that case went to appeal. The court found the process unconstitutional and reversed the fine in full. She let it sit for a moment, then continued. In its written opinion, the appellate court stated, quote, where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement. The integrity of due process demands more than assumption. Her tone never changed. She wasn't trying to perform. She was building pressure line by line, statute by statute. She flipped the second page. Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, 2019, an officer issued a fine based on a visual assessment. No photos, no timestamps, no physical record. City argued it was standard practice. The court disagreed in its ruling. It stated, administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Fines must be based on verifiable fact or they are void under constitutional review. She looked up slowly, locking eyes with Monroe. That ruling was upheld at every level, and that was the first time Monroe shifted. It was small, a tightening of the jaw, a slight adjustment of his shoulders, but Jasmine caught it. So did the others. The clerk's typing resumed almost with urgency. Now the prosecutor uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, hands clasped, suddenly more spectator than participant. Jasmine leaned in too, not physically but rhetorically. "You fine me $15,000, she said, without requesting evidence, without allowing argument, voice hardened. Not louder, just sharper. "There is no documentation, no testimony, just your word, and respectfully your honor. That is not justice. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes." A subtle wave of discomfort moved through the gallery. Attorneys in the back exchanged quick glances, as if silently asking each other, "Is she really saying this?" She was, and she wasn't finished. Jasmine tapped her file one more time. "I bring these cases not as theory, but as binding reminders of what this courtroom is supposed to represent when a judge ignores process, silences defense, and rules without proof. They are not interpreting the law, they are violating it, and I won't let that happen quietly." She stood still, eyes locked on Monroe. Her voice lowered to almost a whisper, but it carried like thunder. "You can ignore my argument, but you can't erase precedent, and you will not rewrite the Constitution from behind that bench." Judge Monroe didn't blink at first, but Jasmine noticed the shift. His jaw tightened, his eyes lost their sharp focus for half a second, darting toward the clerk, then toward the prosecution table. His fingers, once calmly resting on the bench, began to tap a slow, uneven rhythm. He was calculating hard. Every move he'd made up to this point had been built on control, on intimidation, on the assumption that Jasmine would either back down or crack under pressure. But now the foundation he stood on had started to fracture. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had done it with surgical precision. Citing appellate rulings and constitutional language, he could not dismiss without making a mockery of the very legal system he claimed to uphold. And that terrified him more than anger ever could. His voice, when it finally came, had lost its earlier bite. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said abruptly. Then stood no explanation, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. It was an escape disguised as procedure. A retreat hidden behind decorum. The bailiff moved quickly, opening the door to chambers, as Monroe disappeared behind it, his robe trailing like a shield he was no longer confident in carrying. But Jasmine knew exactly what had just happened. That wasn't a break to consider evidence, that was a tactical withdrawal, a pause to strategize, to call someone, to dig for anything he could use to discredit her, derail her, or delay the inevitable. Because now he wasn't just facing a lawyer. He was facing accountability. The courtroom for a moment remained still, as if unsure whether it had permission to breathe again. The clerk looked visibly unsettled, eyes flickering toward Jasmine but never fully meeting her gaze. The prosecutor sat stone-faced, but his fingers fidgeted nervously in his lap. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't move. She remained standing, her back straight, her hands still resting gently on the stack of precedents she had just unloaded like live ammunition. She wasn't looking for applause, she was reading the room, and what she saw was exactly what Monroe feared. Doubt creeping into the cracks of his authority, doubt rippling across every silent observer who had just witnessed what few ever dared to say aloud in a courtroom, that even a judge could be wrong. Even a judge could be cornered 15 minutes, that was all he'd asked for. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't 15 minutes of reflection. It was 15 minutes to save himself. He would try to rewrite his strategy shift, the narrative, maybe even bring in reinforcements, because the only thing more dangerous than a well-prepared attorney is one who is fearless, grounded in truth, and unwilling to yield under pressure. Jasmine had just stepped across a line that most never dared approach. She didn't just demand fairness, she forced the court to imbalance, and Monroe, for all his years on the bench, had no playbook for that. As the clock ticked on and the room settled into a fragile, uncertain quiet, Jasmine remained still, ready, focused, and unshaken. The judge had left to search for higher ground, but she wasn't going anywhere. Not until every inch of that courtroom remembered what it meant to stand for justice. When the door to the judge's chambers finally opened, all eyes turned and then narrowed with confusion. Judge Monroe re-entered, but this time he wasn't alone behind him. Walked a second figure, taller, older, with a gait that radiated institutional gravity, Judge Thomas Whitaker. His black robe seemed heavier than Monroe's, the fabric moving with the kind of deliberate weight only earned through decades of federal bench power. The room shifted instantly. It wasn't just about another body in the courtroom, it was about what his presence implied. A low murmur swept through the gallery. Not of curiosity, but of unease. Even the court officer stood taller, straighter, as if suddenly realizing this case had graduated from routine to something far more combustible. Jasmine didn't need anyone to tell her what this meant. You don't summon Judge Whitaker into a hearing like this unless something is spiraling, and Monroe, for all his arrogance, had finally felt the rope tightening. Monroe returned to the bench, his voice stripped of the dominance carried earlier. "For the record," he said, clearing his throat, "I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe, and if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural questions that have arisen." It was a carefully crafted statement, one meant to sound procedural, impartial routine, but everyone in that room could hear the truth buried underneath. He was losing control, and now he needed someone with more authority to anchor the ship before it capsized. Monroe didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't not. After the precision with which she dismantled his earlier ruling, instead he leaned back, almost disappearing into his chair, letting Whitaker's presence fill the space he could no longer command. Jasmine stood calmly, but her senses were on high alert. She had read about Whitaker, a former appellate judge turned senior federal overseer, known for his intellect, his ruthlessness and cross-review, and his iron sense of courtroom order. He wasn't the type to shout he didn't need to. One look from him was often more effective than 100 objections. And now that gaze landed on Jasmine not with hostility, but with razor-sharp scrutiny. He was assessing her. Not just her words, but her posture, her breath cadence of her silence, and Jasmine knew what this meant. She was no longer just defending herself from a biased ruling. She was standing trial in front of the system itself. She didn't waver. She met his gaze 1 second longer than necessary. Her chin lifted, her presence anchored. She wasn't intimidated, but she was aware this wasn't just a courtroom. Now it was a battlefield of legacy versus reform, of entitlement versus earned credibility. Monroe had brought in Whitaker, hoping to tip the scales to outrank her voice with hierarchy. But Jasmine had something neither robe could override: precedent, constitutional grounding, and an undeniable record of being right. This wasn't just a legal defense anymore. It was a challenge to the hierarchy that had allowed Monroe to operate unchecked for years. Whitaker adjusted his robe, glanced down at the case file on the bench, and finally spoke. His voice was even deliberate but unmistakably commanding. "Miss Crockett," he said, "you've raised several constitutional concerns regarding the enforcement of Code 20. Would like you to restate your core argument for the record. It wasn't a request, it was a test, a live audit." And Jasmine understood she had walked into a rigged courtroom, dismantled the trap, and now had to defend her truth under federal spotlight. One misstep, and everything could collapse, but one precise word, and she would not only survive this room, she'd own it. And so without looking down, without hesitation, she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the due process failures supported by appellate precedent." Her voice didn't just respond, it declared. The rules had changed, the power had shifted, and Monroe knew it. Whitaker was here to weigh the law, but the courtroom, it was already leaning toward Jasmine. The courtroom had settled into a cold, humming quiet. Jasmine stood at the defense table, her hand lightly resting on the leather edge of her folder. She didn't move as the bailiff called Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand from the back of the room. A man rose with the stiff posture of someone who believed he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His navy blue uniform was spotless, his badge gleaming like it had just been polished for this moment. He walked with the kind of confidence that comes from 2 decades of never being challenged. That was about to change. Jasmine watched him with surgical stillness. Ellis didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead like a man checking off a form he'd filled out 100 times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and repeated the oath. Then he sat down, folded his hands, and waited like he already knew how this would end. Jasmine took 3 slow steps toward the witness box. Not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to let him and everyone watching feel the weight of what was coming. "Officer Ellis," she began, her tone calm, not confrontational. "You issued the citation that resulted in the fine against me, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied easily, almost too casually. "And that citation was based on a violation you claimed to have observed." "That's right." She nodded slightly. "Let's break that down. Did you document the alleged photographs?" "No, ma'am," he said. Shaking his head, didn't need to. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. "Did you write a detailed incident report?" No diagram, no witness affidavit, no time-stamped image from a city camera, none required." Ellis replied with a small shrug. "Was there anyone else present at the time of the alleged violation?" "Number 1 was alone." Jasmine paused for 1 full second. Then she turned slightly toward the gallery and the bench. Her words were slow, deliberate. "So to be clear, you issued a fine for $15,000 based entirely on your personal judgment, with no photographic evidence, no written report, no third-party verification, and no supporting documentation." "Yes," he said again this time with a touch of irritation. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like there." It was the moment of arrogance, the assumption that experience equals immunity. Jasmine's lips curled into a faint smile. Controlled, calculated. "I'm sure you do, officer," she said, her tone velvet with just the slightest edge of steel. "But we're not here to debate your instincts. We're here to talk about evidence." Ellis shifted. It wasn't a large movement, but it was enough. The confidence so firm a minute ago now had a crack. She took a small step closer. "Do you believe that your personal opinion without supporting evidence is enough to override the due process rights of a citizen in a federal court?" His brow furrowed. "I believe my experience gives me the ability to make sound judgments in the field." "Judgments?" "Yes," Jasmine said, her voice cooling, "but fines, penalties, legal consequences that carry weight under the Constitution." She turned back to the bench. "Your Honors, what we have here is not enforcement, it's assumption, not process. It's projection. Officer Ellis didn't observe a crime. He interpreted one and then treated that interpretation as law." She returned her eyes to Ellis. "Can you point to anything in the citation file, anything that constitutes physical verifiable evidence?" "No, ma'am," he said, quieter. Now Jasmine didn't gloat. She let the silence speak. Instead, a long pause. Every eye was on her. She turned toward the bench again, her tone sharpening. "Your Honor." "Whitaker, Your Honor." "Monroe, this officer just admitted under oath that his entire case is based on subjective judgment, not probable cause, not statutory measurement, just a feeling she tapped the side of her folder, and yet a $15,000 fine was levied. Not on proof, not on documentation, but on what one man thought he saw." Whitaker leaned forward slightly. His fingers steepled. He didn't say anything, but his silence no longer felt neutral. Jasmine stepped forward again, lowering her voice. "This isn't about Officer Ellis. It's about the standard we accept in a court of law. If this is allowed to stand, if a fine can be imposed without a shred of real evidence, then every citizen is just one bad mood away from a financial death sentence. Because what Ellis is calling enforcement, the Constitution calls arbitrary, and the courts call it unconstitutional." She turned back toward the gallery, scanning the faces. Some looked stunned, others disturbed. A few, like the younger attorneys in the back row, looked newly awakened, as if they were watching the very definition of power imbalance being dismantled in real time. She returned her focus to the officer's final question. "Officer Ellis, if someone were to challenge your citation like we are now, what evidence would you offer this court to support your decision?" Ellis looked at the judges, then at Jasmine. He hesitated. His throat moved as he swallowed. "I would say that I acted within the scope of my experience," noted Jasmine replied, voice sharp as glass. So we are left with this a $15,000 punishment based solely on one man's memory with zero physical evidence and no oversight. Then she said it, the line that cracked the room open. So what you're calling a citation officer is really just your opinion in uniform. A fine dressed up in personal belief. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was electric. Thick. Every person in that courtroom realized the weight of what had just been said. The state's case wasn't just weak, it was hollow. The emperor had no clothes, and Jasmine had just called it out with a surgeon's grace. Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. Monroe looked down at his bench lips pressed thin. The prosecutor didn't speak. He couldn't, because anything said in defense of Ellis now would only confirm how far this had gone off the rails. Jasmine took a single step back, not in retreat but in finality. Her message had landed. The system that tried to steamroll her now sat in stunned silence, facing the simple truth she had dragged into the light. You cannot punish without proof. Not in this courtroom. Not today. Not anymore. Jasmine turned back toward the bench, her hand resting gently on the folder that now lay open like a loaded weapon. Her voice lowered, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted every person in the room to lean in and listen. Your honors, she said, looking first at Whitaker, then Monroe. You've heard the legal precedent, you've heard the procedural failure, but let's not pretend this is about paper anymore. This is about people, real people, who never got the chance to stand in this courtroom. People who were crushed by the weight of invisible authority, just like I nearly was today. She slowly flipped a page inside the folder, then held it in the air. Let me introduce you to Daniel Reeve, Vietnam veteran, lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He came home from war with shrapnel in his leg and a dream in his gut to open his own repair garage. He spent 2 decades building it, saved every dime, rebuilt transmissions by hand, helped other vets for free when they were down on their luck, and then one day, out of nowhere, the city emailed him saying his business license was suspended, not revoked for misconduct, not flagged for safety violations, suspended because of an administrative oversight. His online renewal was missing one checkbox, just one, no phone call, no warning, just a line of red text in a government database. She let the silence sit for a moment. The judge's pen hovered above the paper but didn't move. The gallery was absolutely still. He tried to appeal, but no one would hear him. They said the system had auto-flagged his file, and while he was trying to fight that invisible machine, customers left rent piled up within 3 months. Daniel was out of business. He lost his shop, then his house. The city finally admitted the mistake. 6 months later, you know what they gave him? Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. A letter of apology typed, no signature. She turned the page. Karen Bautista, Savannah, Georgia. Master electrician, 15 years. No accidents, no violations. She trained apprentices, ran her own crew. Then 1 year, the city quietly changed the licensing codes. Suddenly, her state license was labeled non-transferable under revised municipal standards. No one could explain what that meant. Not the board, not the clerk. But they told her she couldn't pull permits anymore, couldn't inspect, couldn't work. She was told to start over like her career had never existed. She fought it. She asked for clarity. She even filed a public records request, and they denied it, saying the transition policy was internal. Jasmine inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, controlling not just her breath, but the entire rhythm of the courtroom. He looked straight at Monroe, and her voice sharpened like a scalpel. And what did they call that decision? Your Honor, standardization, that's the word they used. Cold, bureaucratic standardization. She paused again. She eventually moved to Florida to start again. She lost her crew, her contracts, her home, her name, and no one was ever held accountable. Now came the final story. She placed the last page on top of the stack, then looked out at the gallery before speaking. James Weller. 62, retired long-haul trucker, lived outside Waco, Texas, used his pension to buy a small piece of land, built a cedar fence with his own 2 hands. It was 17 inches over the city's invisible property line. 17, the city said he was encroaching on public land and fined him over $10,000 when he asked for a land survey. They told him, quote, "It's already been decided." He couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't afford an appeal. So he tore the whole fence down by hand in the heat and the dust. Took him 2 days. Jasmine's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. On the 3rd day they fined him again, this time for incomplete demolition because some posts were still in the ground. The courtroom was a vacuum. Now no one shifted, no one coughed. Even Monroe had stopped pretending to look busy. Everyone felt it, the weight of what Jasmine had just dragged into the light. These weren't statistics, they were scars. They were the evidence that the system, when left to its own ego, becomes a predator. Jasmine turned her full attention to Judge Whitaker. "So let's stop pretending this is just a hearing about a minor fine. Let's stop pretending I'm the only one this has happened to." Her voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction. What happened to Daniel, Karen, and James wasn't some freak accident. It wasn't a glitch, it was power with no brakes, a system that can ruin a life without ever proving a thing. And it's the same thing that nearly happened to me today. She raised her hand, palm open. No evidence, no documentation, no witnesses, just one officer's opinion in a courtroom willing to stamp it without question. What if I hadn't shown up with this folder? What if I hadn't known the law? What if I had just paid the fine like most people do, and walked away thinking I'd done something wrong? She looked around the room. That's how it happens. That's how people give up. That's how injustice survives. It wears the face of official procedure and waits for no one to challenge it. She returned her eyes to Whitaker. Her tone now quiet, but iron-solid, unchecked power is a loaded weapon in the hands of men who forget who they serve. And then the final line, the one that brought the entire courtroom to the edge, power that answers to no one doesn't protect the people. It hunts them slowly, quietly, until one day it knocks on your door and there's no one left to stand in the way. And for a long moment after she finished, not a single word was said because there was nothing left to say. The silence after Jasmine's final statement was not just heavy. It was crushing, the kind that wraps around a courtroom like a storm about to break. Judge Monroe stared at her for a moment too long, lips pressed into a hard line as if trying to calculate the cost of what he was about to say. His fingers twitched once against the polished wood of the bench. He looked down, then back up, and finally spoke, not with the thunderous authority he had used earlier, but with a colder, calculated defiance. "This court," he said slowly, "retains the right of judicial discretion. We are not bound to accept every argument brought before us simply because it is forcefully delivered." His tone was firm but hollow when necessary. This court exercises its authority to maintain order and enforce compliance. That authority, he added, is not up for debate. It was a thin veil, a final desperate swing to reclaim control, not based on law, but on ego. The courtroom felt it. Everyone did. This wasn't justice speaking. This was a man grasping for the last thread of power, slipping from his hands. He wasn't defending the ruling. He was defending himself. Jasmine didn't react immediately. She let the air settle, let his words hang awkwardly in the stillness. Then she stepped forward just once. Her voice was quieter now, but it carried like a razor through the room. "Your Honor," she said, eyes locked on Monroe. "Judicial discretion does not mean judicial supremacy. The power of this bench, of any bench, exists only within the bounds of the law." She turned slightly, addressing the entire room. "Discretion is not a shield for error. It is not a sword for bias. It is a tool meant to be used with care, never in place of evidence, and certainly never in place of the truth." She turned back to Monroe, her voice tightening. "This fine was imposed with no documentation, no physical proof, no witnesses, just a single officer's unverified claim. You called it enforcement. But what it is assumption. A $15,000 punishment based on nothing but a feeling that's not discretion. That's lawlessness, wearing a robe." Monroe's jaw clenched for a moment. It looked like he might snap back, raise his voice issue. Another blanket statement. But before he could speak, Judge Whitaker shifted forward. He hadn't said a word in minutes, but now his voice came with slow, deliberate finality. "I've heard enough," he said. Not loud, but with the kind of weight that silences everything else. Miss Crockett is correct. Judicial discretion cannot override constitutional standards. It cannot substitute fact with assumption. The impact of that sentence landed hard. You could feel it. The gallery went still. No whispers. No movement. Even Monroe didn't look at Whitaker because he didn't have to. He already knew what that meant. The moment Whitaker voiced agreement, the floor beneath Monroe's entire argument crumbled. Whitaker continued his tone, measured but absolute. "In this case, we have no supporting documentation, no corroborating witness, and no substantive evidence to justify the penalty. The officer's statement, unverified, unsupported, does not meet the evidentiary threshold required for enforcement." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. "This court cannot and should not uphold a fine on the basis of personal interpretation alone. We set precedent not for justice, but for unchecked power." Monroe sat completely still, his hands now folded tightly in front of him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't deepen the hole. Already dug around him, his authority had been challenged and then dismantled in his own courtroom. He had tried to override process with presence, precedent with posture, but now in front of the very people he once intimidated with silence, he had no standing left, finally, after a pause so long it bordered on unbearable. Monroe leaned slightly forward. His voice, when it returned, was brittle and forced. "This court," he began, eyes low, "finds that there is insufficient evidentiary support to sustain the penalty imposed under Municipal Code 22F. He swallowed once, and the gavel in his hand remained untouched. Accordingly, the fine is vacated, the charge is dismissed." The words hung in the air, not as victory, but as acknowledgement of failure, of overreach of a system that nearly crushed someone who simply refused to bow to it. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She simply stood calm, composed, as if the dismissal was inevitable, because to her, it was not because the system worked, but because she had forced it to the gallery, remained still stunned. Even the prosecutor sat motionless, hands folded tightly, eyes lowered. No one spoke, and yet everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't just won a legal battle, she had exposed a rot. She had walked into a courtroom where everything was against her timing, posture, reputation. Even the judge and she had torn the walls down brick by brick using only truth, law, and clarity. Judge Monroe, the man who began the day wielding absolute control, now sat quiet, outranked, outarged, outmaneuvered, and in his silence, the message was clear: the court hadn't ruled in Jasmine's favor, it had surrendered to her refusal to be erased. This wasn't a fine being dismissed. This was a system being reminded of its purpose. The courtroom had settled into a silence so profound that even the hum of the overhead light seemed to pause in reverence to what had just transpired. The day had begun with the kind of tension that promised nothing more than a routine administrative hearing, a case that should have been a mere footnote in the docket yet. As the hours passed, the atmosphere had transformed into a crucible of power, prejudice, and defiant truth now, with the final ruling delivered and the weight of injustice hanging palpably in the air. The scene before the judge's attorneys and every silent witness was one of irrevocable change. Judge Monroe, whose earlier words had dripped with unchallenged authority, now sat motionless behind his bench, his eyes fixed on the worn wood before him. The authority he had clung to had evaporated in the wake of Jasmine Crockett's relentless pursuit of due process. It was in that charged moment, the courtroom frozen in time, that the inevitable confrontation with truth had begun, a truth that would not be silenced by power, no matter how heavily draped in a robe. After what felt like an eternity of stillness, Monroe's gaze finally lifted. Meeting Jasmine's unwavering stare, his voice, once a booming assertion of control, came out in a strained, almost defeated murmur. "I underestimated you." Those words, so casually whispered yet loaded with the bitter sting of concession, broke through the oppressive silence like a shard of glass. They were not meant for public consumption. They were a private acknowledgement of his failure to anticipate the strength of her resolve. Jasmine, standing tall and unbowed at the front of the courtroom, allowed a slight measured smile to play at the corners of her mouth, of triumph, but of quiet vindication. "You wouldn't be the first, sir," she replied softly, her voice carrying a calm defiance that resonated with every person present in that brief exchange. The dynamic of the room had shifted irrevocably. The heavy burden of unchallenged authority was lifted just a fraction, replaced by the dawning recognition that true justice required more than power. It required accountability for a long moment. The courtroom remained suspended in this bittersweet pause. The silence was not empty. It was brimming with the collective realization that what had occurred was more than a legal victory. It was the birth of a precedent that would reverberate far beyond these walls without another word. Jasmine turned away from the bench. Each step she took down the polished marble aisle was measured, resonating with the rhythmic click of her heels, as if punctuating the beat of a revolution. Every step was a testament to the countless hours of preparation, the battles fought in smaller rooms, and the courage summoned in moments when the weight of injustice threatened to crush the spirit of the vulnerable. The gallery watched in hushed awe as she passed by rows of silent spectators, many of whom now understood that they were witnessing not just a legal decision, but a transformation of the very fabric of the system. Her steady march was a silent declaration that even when power is misused and the scales of justice are tipped by unchecked authority, the voice of truth can still rise to reclaim what is rightfully ours. Outside, the corridors of the courthouse echoed with the sound of her footsteps, a sound that carried far beyond the immediate realm of legal proceedings. The daylight that spilled through the grand entrance seemed almost symbolic, a metaphor for transparency and hope, breaking through the murk of corruption and hidden abuses. As Jasmine reached the heavy oak doors, she paused momentarily with a final backward glance. She observed the room where Monroe's defeat was etched in every furrow of his brow and in every silent nod of agreement from those who had dared to stand with her. In that fleeting moment, the eyes of every person in the room, from the junior clerks to the seasoned lawyers, bore witness to a truth that could no longer be denied. The law was not a tool for oppression, but a shield for the people. The door creaked open, and with one final resolute step, Jasmine emerged into the quarter, bathed in soft, forgiving light. The hum of the world outside resumed, as if acknowledging the significance of but within her, the victory was complex. It was not a triumph, celebrated with cheers or accolades. Instead, it was a precedent etched into the annals of this courtroom and destined to influence every future case where power threatened to overwhelm justice. The injustice she had faced was not unique. It was systemic, rooted in a culture of unchecked authority that had long oppressed the voices of the marginalized. Yet by standing her ground and demanding accountability, she had carved a path for change. Her actions today were a reminder that true power lies not in the ability to silence dissent, but in the courage to confront it. Head on, every detail of the day would be remembered. The cold, calculated tone of Monroe's ruling, the palpable tension that had filled every corner of the room, and the way the gallery had collectively held its breath as the final verdict was announced, those moments, seemingly small yet infinitely significant, were the sparks that could ignite a broader movement for justice. The injustice of a fine imposed without evidence, the arrogance of a system that assumed guilt without proof. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a much larger narrative, and now, thanks to Jasmine's unwavering resolve, that narrative had been disrupted within the courtroom. A subtle but undeniable change had taken root. Judges who once presided over cases with an iron fist might now think twice before issuing rulings without due process. prosecutors previously content to operate within the confines of an unjust system might now find themselves challenged by the very precedents they had taken for granted. And every citizen who had ever felt the sting of arbitrary power, those who had lost their livelihoods, their dignity, or even their homes, now had a beacon of hope. For in Jasmine's measured defiance, in her unyielding demand for the truth, lay the promise of accountability. The law, when left unchecked, becomes a weapon, a tool for the powerful to crush the weak. But when that same law is wielded by those who respect its principles, it becomes a shield today. Jasmine had shown the world that the shield could be reclaimed, that even in the face of overwhelming institutional power, justice could find a way. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the murmurs of conversation began to rise again, soft at first, then louder, as if everyone was trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Some whispered about the improbability of such a moment, a judge admitting his error, a system buckling under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Others spoke of Jasmine's courage in hushed tones, reverently discussing the implications of her actions for future cases. Every whisper, every exchange glance reinforced the fact that this was no ordinary dismissal. This was a watershed moment, a turning point in the ongoing battle against systemic injustice. Even Judge Whitaker, whose measured authority had been a constant throughout the proceedings, seemed to radiate a quiet sense of resolve. His eyes, which had earlier scrutinized every move with detached precision, now shone with a hint of satisfaction, a silent affirmation that the scales of justice had been righted at least in this instance. And though Judge Monroe had been forced to issue a ruling that vacated the fine, his part in this drama was over the finality of his statement. "The fine is hereby vacated, the charges dismissed," was not so much a victory as it was an admission that his earlier assertions had been untenable. It was as if he had been caught in the act of subverting the law and, with no recourse left, was forced to retreat in defeat. In the weeks that followed, the reverberation would be felt far beyond the courthouse walls. Legal journals would cite the case as a pivotal moment in administrative law, a clear example of how unchecked power could be dismantled by a single determined voice standing for what was right. Law schools would discuss the case as a turning point in the interpretation of judicial discretion, and practicing attorneys would recall the day as when the very essence of due process was defended with unwavering conviction. Yet for Jasmine, the significance was deeply personal. It wasn't just about a fine being overturned, it was about reclaiming a sense of dignity that had been chipped away by years of systemic bias and bureaucratic indifference. Every step she took that day, from the moment she first walked into the courtroom to the final echo of her footsteps as she left, was a testament to the power of perseverance. It was a reminder that the law in its truest form was not a tool for oppression, but a mechanism for justice, a means to ensure that every individual, regardless of their background or station, was given a fair hearing. And as she exited the courthouse, the world outside seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the weight of injustice had momentarily lifted. Jasmine's journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more moments when the system would try to silence voices of reason with bureaucratic might. But that day, in that sacred chamber of justice, she had proved something vital, that even the most entrenched power could be challenged, that the law was not an infallible decree of the mighty, but a living, breathing promise to protect the vulnerable. It was a promise she had reaffirmed with every word, every citation, every measured step, as the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind her, sealing off the space where history had been rewritten. A sense of quiet determination filled the quarters. The echoes of her defiant stance would linger in those halls, a constant reminder that when power goes unchecked, it becomes a weapon. But when questioned, when held accountable, that same power can be harnessed to uplift and protect. The precedent had been set, not with a grand celebratory fanfare, but with the steady, unyielding march of truth, echoed by a woman who refused to be silenced in that moment, as the light of the afternoon filtered in through the tall windows and cast long, dramatic shadows across the floor. Every person present felt the shift the scales of justice had tilted, if only for a moment, in favor of accountability. And though the battle was won without the clamor of victory, it was a victory. Nonetheless, a victory of conscience over corruption of evidence, over assumption of due process, over despotic discretion. Jasmine walked away from the courtroom not as a triumphant conqueror, but as someone who had borne the weight of injustice, and by standing firm had lifted a small corner of it. Her eyes held the promise of more fights to come, a silent vow that she would never again allow unchecked power to crush the rights of the few. And as the courthouse doors swung shut behind her, sealing away the echoes of that fateful day, the legacy of her courage began to seep into every crevice of the legal system, a legacy that would remind future generations that no one is above the law, and that sometimes the greatest victories are the precedents that force a system to change. In the days, months, and years that followed, those who had witnessed the trial would speak of it with reverence and caution. Legal scholars would debate the implications, citing the case as an example of what can happen when a discretion is finally held to account. Young attorneys would carry the memory of that day like a beacon, a reminder that the law could be both a sword and a shield when wielded with integrity, and for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic overreach, Jasmine's resolute stand would become a symbol, a testament, that even in the darkest moments, one voice anchored in truth could change the course of history. The courtroom had not merely witnessed a ruling, it had witnessed a transformation of power, of process, and of the collective understanding of what it meant to serve justice. And though Judge Monroe's final words had been delivered in a voice weakened by defeat, the message that resonated through the halls of that courthouse was undeniable: justice, when stripped of evidence and due process, is nothing more than an empty shell. It is a system that must be questioned, held accountable, and ultimately reformed. Jasmine's quiet departure was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where every ruling would be scrutinized, every fine justified, and every enforcement measure grounded in verifiable fact. As she disappeared into the fading light, her silhouette mingled with the shadows of the courthouse, leaving behind an indelible mark on every heart and mind present that day. It was a reminder that while the battle against systemic injustice might be long and arduous, each victory, each precedent brings us one step closer to a world where power is truly held in check and every individual is given the respect and protection they deserve. And so the day ended not with the triumphant roar of victory, but with a solemn acknowledgement of the hard-won truth that true justice is not handed over on a judge's whim, but is earned through unwavering courage, relentless inquiry, and the steadfast refusal to let power go unchecked. Jasmine Crockett had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had rekindled a flame that would light the way for all who believed that the law should serve the people, not the other way around. In the weeks following Jasmine Crockett's groundbreaking courtroom victory, a tremor of change began to ripple through cities across the nation. Municipal offices that had long relied on unchecked discretion were suddenly forced to re-examine hundreds of fines issued without a single shred of evidence. It started in a modest Midwestern city, when a local attorney's inquiry into an arbitrary $15,000 penalty revealed that over 100 fines had been levied solely on the basis of an officer's personal judgment. One by one, city after city found themselves compelled to sift records and audit enforcement practices that had for too long been shrouded in bureaucratic secrecy. The discovery was staggering. Thousands of citizens had been financially crippled by fines that were not backed by any physical documentation, witness testimony, or objective measurement. Community outrage began to swell as people realized that these penalties, once seen as isolated administrative errors, were actually part of a systemic failure that allowed unchecked power to reign. The realization sent shockwaves through local governments, which now faced intense public scrutiny and the urgent demand for transparency and reform. Officials scrambled to explain how fines had been imposed based solely on the opinion of a single officer, without any corroborating evidence. and many found themselves caught in the glare of an enraged public. In a matter of weeks, the narrative shifted from isolated incidents to a national reckoning, with administrative overreach. Jasmine Crockett's victory in that fateful courtroom became the spark that ignited a nationwide movement for reform. Her case, meticulously documented and boldly argued, was cited as a watershed moment by legal scholars and activists alike. It wasn't long before municipalities across the country began reviewing their own records, and in some cities, hundreds of fines were rescinded after it was revealed that they had been imposed without proper evidence in boardrooms. In city council meetings, officials were forced to confront a bitter truth. A system that allowed fines to be based on personal opinion rather than verifiable fact was inherently flawed and dangerous. Grassroots organizations sprang into action demanding that local governments establish stricter guidelines for evidence-based enforcement and hold officers accountable for arbitrary decisions. The momentum of this movement was palpable. Communities that had once felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic overreach now found their voices amplified. Protests in public forums erupted, where citizens demanded transparency and the promise that no one would ever again suffer the consequences of an officer's unchecked discretion. Through every new policy review and every overturned fine, Jasmine's case was cited as a beacon of hope, a powerful reminder that when the people demand accountability, even the mightiest institutions can be compelled to change. As the story gained traction, the media continued to cast a bright light on the sweeping changes that were unfolding. Television networks, newspapers, and online platforms ran constant coverage of the emerging reforms. Major news programs returned with follow-up reports on the sweeping audits, documenting how cities in Texas, Florida, and New York were grappling with the fallout of a system that had long operated without sufficient checks. In one memorable segment, 60 Minutes showcased interviews with former victims of arbitrary fines, business owners, veterans, and everyday citizens whose stories resonated with viewers around the country. These personal accounts, raw and unfiltered, revealed the true human cost of punitive measures imposed without evidence. They recounted tales of financial ruin, shattered dreams, and a pervasive sense of injustice that had left entire communities distrustful of those in power. The reporters presented hard-hitting statistics that demonstrated how thousands of fines ranging from a few $100s to tens of thousands had been levied in error over the past decade. With each story, it became increasingly clear that the problem was not isolated, but systemic, and it demanded urgent reform. The public was on local officials mounted to explain, justify, and ultimately change the flawed processes that had led to so many unwarranted penalties for Jasmine Crockett. The impact of her courtroom victory was both profound and far-reaching. She had not only defended her own rights, but had also laid a crucial cornerstone in the edifice of American justice. Her case served as a catalyst for reform, a turning point that exposed the dangers of unchecked administrative power and ignited a nationwide movement to protect citizens from arbitrary enforcement. Legal experts began to refer to her case as a landmark precedent, a reminder that the law must always be grounded in evidence, transparency, and fairness. Law schools began incorporating her arguments into their curricula, teaching new generations of attorneys. The importance of fighting for due process. Conferences and seminars buzzed with discussions about the need for stricter oversight of municipal enforcement, and policymakers across the country cited her case as a reason to overhaul outdated practices. Jasmine's steadfast determination had transformed her personal battle into a broader crusade for justice, ensuring that every citizen would be better protected against the misuse of power across the nation. Communities that had once been silenced by the weight of bureaucratic indifference now found their voices. The reforms triggered by her case brought hope to those who had suffered under a system that prioritized authority over fairness. With each overturned fine and every revised policy, the promise of a more just and equitable system began to take shape. The legacy of Jasmine Crockett's victory was not measured in loud declarations or fleeting moments of triumph. It was etched into the daily lives of ordinary people who no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary punishment. It became a beacon for future generations, a reminder that when power is left unchecked, it can only serve as a threat to the rights of the people. But when challenged, held accountable, and reformed, that same power can become a force for good, protecting the very principles upon which this nation was built. In the end, Jasmine Crockett did more than win a legal battle. She changed the course of history. Her courage in the face of injustice inspired a movement that re-examined and reformed a system marred by arbitrary fines and unverified claims. Her victory was not a solitary moment of triumph, but a spark that ignited widespread reform, one that reshaped how administrative power was exercised, ensuring that every penalty would be supported by evidence and administered with fairness. In doing so, she laid a new cornerstone in American justice, one that would stand as a testament to the enduring power of truth, accountability, and the unyielding resolve of those who dare to stand up against oppression. Her story became a rallying cry for every citizen who had ever felt powerless, a symbol of the fact that when you question authority, when you demand evidence, and when you insist on due process, you can indeed change the world. And though the road ahead remained long and filled with challenges, Jasmine Crockett's legacy shone as a reminder that the fight for justice is never over, and that even the smallest voice can echo loudly enough to reshape an entire nation. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story together. Our voices make